Hi, good evening, everyone. Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Whitechapel Gallery. My name's Richard Martin. I'm the Daskanopoulos Director of Education and Public Programmes here at the Gallery, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you to our Spring Big Ideas talk by Zing Tsjeng. It's wonderful to see all of you here in our auditorium, and a special welcome to those of you joining on our live stream. I hope you're comfortable wherever you're watching. So tonight's event is part of our Big Ideas series, which offers a platform for leading artists, writers, theorists, thinkers, and creative practitioners to share and discuss their work. And we're very grateful to the Stanley Trust, who continue to support this series. And across this spring season here at the Whitechapel, we're thinking about questions of work and process. And this is drawing on the themes of our major exhibition, Surveying a Century of Artist Studios. So we're keen to explore how the forms, the spaces, and the value of creative work are changing, and the voices and platforms that are shaping contemporary culture. With all of this in mind, we're thrilled this evening to have with us Zing Tsjeng. She is, as the British Journalism Awards described her, a one-woman multimedia practitioner. She's a journalist and currently editor-in-chief of Vice UK. She's an author and has written the Forgotten Women book series. She's a presenter, with her work including the BBC podcast United Zingdom and the Vice World News video series Empires of Dirt. And I think uniting this work is a dedication to engaging audiences and to highlighting marginalized histories and voices. And many thanks to Zing for taking the time to join us this evening, and to my colleague Ruth for putting together tonight's event. Zing will talk for around 45 minutes about a range of her projects and passions, and she's also going to share some film footage with us. And there will then be an opportunity for you to ask questions and to join the conversation. And if you can wait for the microphone to reach you, that would be especially appreciated so that our online audiences can hear your contribution. And on that note, I should add that our talk will remain available on our online platforms after this evening, with captions included. Lastly, if you're able and comfortable to wear a face mask in our auditorium, we'd encourage you to do so. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoy the evening, and thank you so much for joining us. And please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Zing Tsjeng.
Thank you so much for coming. Honestly, the pang of fear that went through my heart when Richard mentioned this talk was sold out. I really appreciate you spending an evening with me. And thank you to the Whitechapel Gallery for asking me to give one of its Big Ideas talks as one of the Ways of Knowing series, which is exploring ideas around work and process. And I actually have to admit that I was slightly taken aback when the good people at the gallery asked me to give this talk. First of all, because I am not an artist, and I think you can actually trace the exact moment my artistic dreams died in art class in secondary school, when my teacher told me that a chili that I painted looked more like an aubergine. So that was the end of my art career then. And secondly, because unlike many of the people in the gallery's excellent exhibition about the artist studio, which I hope you'll check out while you're here, I don't actually work with any kind of artistic material or even a studio at all, unless you count a podcasting studio. And I certainly have not been podcasting for as long as some of the artists in this exhibition have been making art. But what I have been doing for 10 odd years is to be a journalist, an author, and a presenter for both video and audio. And it's been a long, varied career that's taken me from London Fashion Week to the Miami Biennale to the cornfields of Ukraine, and maybe less excitingly, cow farms in rural England. It is not really the typical journalist trajectory. A few years ago, a typical journalist trajectory might look a little bit like this. You graduate from journalism school. You get a job on a grad scheme at a newspaper. You then work at a local newspaper and then score a job at a national before slowly working your way up to being the editor of your section or your desk, and then, if you dream really big, the overall paper. before maybe like Piers Morgan, you pivot from that into being a commentator, a public nuisance, and a columnist who charges thousands for every article you file to resentful editors who are paid a tiny fraction of your fee and know it all too well. I started out pretty much on that footing. I attended journalism school around 2011, but the media industry in the world has been through a whole lot of upheaval since, and that's affected my journey and the way I make work too. So with your permission, I'll go into more detail about the work that I do and how I've come to get to that point. At journalism school, I wanted to work at fashion magazines. I'd grown up in Singapore, where I would painstakingly slice open the sealed magazines that were imported from overseas in the bookshop and read them in a corner of the bookshop and then leave without paying. Because honestly, their prices were absolutely unbelievable. When I left journalism school, I got my first job at Wonderland magazine. These are some of the covers that I worked on, and it was as online editor. This is now a very impressive title to get straight out of journalism school, but bear in mind this was 2011, and this was back when Twitter was only a few years old, and magazines didn't quite understand how to work the medium or technology or how they should speak to people on them. They still sounded like these lofty fashion gatekeepers coming down from on high to announce the publication of a new issue, rather than talking like people actually did on social media. So as a fresh university graduate, I was handed total control of all the publication's social media channels, which I used to tweet things like this: note to self, wrapping your hair around your neck when you go outside is not an adequate substitute for a scarf. Funnily enough, this actually became one of Wonderland's most successful tweets at the time, at 16 whole retweets, which tells you something about how dead its Twitter presence was back then. I also came up with the idea to photograph One Direction with golden retriever puppies, which I regard as the pinnacle of my achievement in fashion. In some ways, it's great that my achievements there were somewhat limited, as they paid me below minimum wage as an online editor and operated out the back of a terrace house in Notting Hill with such a bad mold problem that I developed a near constant cough. And after 2 years of hacking like a Victorian chimney sweep, I then joined Dazed as its first ever online news editor. And here I began churning out content, stories, and I do mean churning. So the drive to get traffic and clicks at any cost was all-consuming. And yes, this was all-consuming even at a fairly underground or niche subculture youth media publication. We once had a tech company come into Dazed and show us a platform that scraped social media to show you stories that were trending on other publications, articles that we were then meant to paraphrase and rewrite on our own platform to then scrape up the rest of the traffic off the top, like a really bad hot chocolate. Around the churn, I started to figure out a little bit more about what made me excited as a journalist. And working on the Girls Rule the World issue, which you can see on the screen there, featuring Lupita Nyong'o, I wrote about the rise of online feminism, which was then a new, exciting development on the internet. And it made me realize that I wanted to be someone who wrote about social issues, not fashion. And fashion at the time was beginning to increasingly feel like it was a social issue, but for all the wrong reasons. It was hard for me to cover a fashion week every few months, spring, summer, then autumn, winter, then cruise, then resort, then men's fashion week, and not feel like fashion was somehow stuck in that same churn of trending content. Except this time, people were racking up air miles and burning trees flying from London to Paris and Milan and further afield. So when I got the chance to join Vice as the UK editor of Broadly, its feminist channel, I jumped at the opportunity. I was part of the team that launched it in 2015, and we quickly grew to have journalists stationed in New York, LA, London, and Australia. And it was then that I was approached by an editor at a publishing house called Octopus to write Forgotten Women, a book series celebrating women who were marginalized from history. And together we came up with the idea to have an illustrated book series with illustrations all done by women artists from all over the world, featuring leaders, artists, scientists, and writers. And there were 48 women in each book, which now seems like a completely arbitrary number, but at the time, it was one for every single woman who'd ever won a Nobel Prize. And I'm glad to note that in 2022, that number has since increased to 58 women, although that still makes up a really, really tiny portion of the overall number of prizes handed out to people over the 100-year or so history of the Nobel Prize. It's actually only 6%. Now I will be the first to acknowledge that this is not exactly an original groundbreaking idea. In fact, Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls and other books were the first to put forward this idea of a collected compendium of exceptional women. But I wanted Forgotten Women to feel different. I didn't want, as one example in this publishing trend infamously did, to include a woman like Margaret Thatcher in the book. I wanted the books to be political, to feature difficult women, to include women from all over the world, especially the global south, and to especially include women of all different ethnicities. And I also wanted the books to have a definite but subtle political stance. For example, in Forgotten Women, the writers, you'll find people like Palestinian poet Samira Azam, who writes about Palestinian liberation. In Forgotten Women, the leaders, you'll find resistance fighters like Carlotta Lucumi, an enslaved woman from Africa who led the largest slave uprising in Cuba in 1844, and Lakshmibai, an Indian warrior queen who fought off British colonial forces and was described by soldiers as the Jezebel of India. You'll also find activists like Jayaben Desai, who led the first workers' strike in the UK that linked up South Asian migrant workers with white working-class trade unionists, and civil rights activists like Ida B. Wells, who exposed and investigated lynchings in the South, and 71 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, also refused to be moved from a train carriage reserved for white people because, as she told the ticket holder, "I've bought the first-class ticket for a reason." I wanted to do this because it felt intellectually dishonest to pretend that we have to celebrate all women in history simply because they were women. And as a tweet that recently went viral goes, "I do not support all women. Some of you bitches are very dumb." I think we should be able to criticize and critique women just as much as you criticize, critique men and people of all genders. And that to me feels like an issue of fairness. I wrote the 4 books of Forgotten Women in the space of a year. And even saying this now sounds incredible to me, because when you talk about work in process, I can honestly say that I've never worked harder in my life to do something, and I'm still processing it now. Thankfully, me and my editor can now joke about it. After doing a full day's work on Broadly, I would have dinner and sit down to research and write until about 11 p.m. on midnight. On the weekends, I would go to the British Library from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and do a full day's work on the books, getting first-hand sources out of the archive and speed reading them before writing up a profile or 3. And let me tell you, I've never been so grateful to have ADHD, which means that I can, if pushed, hyper-focus to the point of drowning everything else out. And I've learned that I tend to need about an hour and a half of procrastination before I can actually panic to sit down and work. But once I get into the zone, and with the help of something called Tomato Timer, which counts down work in intervals of 25 minutes or less, I can actually be unstoppable. And I also could not have done this without my partner, who patiently brought me endless cups of tea and cooked endless dinners, which I would eat in complete silence before going up to the study to work. When people talk about the emotional support that builds the foundations for artistic work, that's who I think of. And it makes me feel desperately for the people who are trying to do this work without that community or support around them. And I know I am all the rarer for being a woman in this position, when so often it's women who are expected to be that emotional support for their partners, who are, of course, overwhelmingly tend to be men. The series also served as my crash course in colonial history and empire. I'd never pieced it together before in this way that I did while writing the books, but patriarchy was not just the backdrop for the persecution of women through the ages, it was colonialism and empire too. It's about systems of oppression often enacted through the state that was hostile not just to women, but also to people of color and to LGBTQ people too. And I began to think more and more about this once I started working on a documentary for Vice about the Stansted 15. This is actually one of the least popular documentaries that I've worked on for Vice, which makes me treasure it all the more. For those of you who haven't heard of the Stansted 15 before, they are a group of 15 protesters who broke into Stansted Airport in 2017. They chained themselves to a deportation flight that was due to take off and deport 60 migrants back to Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. And thanks to this, they were tried and convicted on terror-related charges. This was on the basis of legislation that was only introduced after the Lockerbie bombing to prevent further terrorism attacks. It was never meant to be applied to human rights activists. I followed them through this documentary with a crew over the course of their trial and their eventual vindication when they were let off lightly at the time with suspended sentences. Eventually in 2021, their verdict was fortunately overturned completely. And as part of the documentary, I interviewed someone who we called David. We used anonymity to protect his identity in the film. He was due to be deported on that very same flight the Stansted 15 had chained themselves to. And it was only through their actions that he wound up getting enough time to contact his lawyer, who then managed to fight for him to remain in the country. That meant that he was eventually able to stay in the UK and help his partner raise their child, whom she'd only just given birth to before. And I'd like to take the chance now to play you a clip from our interview together. If we could play that clip now. I think I held it together pretty well in that scene. But in all honesty, I felt like crying too. I'd never actually connected with the story that personally before. And the reason for that is my own personal background as an immigrant in the UK. On set, I spoke to one of the Stansted 15 activists, Ruth Hunt, about how she'd first started out in immigration activism. And she'd grown up in Croydon, and she'd seen this queue of people snaking out from Luna House, which is the notorious outpost of the UK Visa and Immigration headquarters. I will read something now that I've written about Luna House for Vice. I'm an immigrant. I moved here from Singapore as a teenager. About a decade ago, I paid over £1,000 to apply for indefinite leave to remain in the UK and several £100 extra for a face-to-face appointment at the Premium Service Centre at Luna House. In total, it cost me about £1,500. I travelled to Croydon with a meticulously detailed folder of documents showing my right to stay in the UK, the sum total of my years here. Employment records, bank statements, P60s, graduation certificates, council tax bills, and letters from my landlord confirming my residence, which he had charged me for. After waiting a couple of hours in the Luna House cafe, I was called into a small booth where an officious woman looked through my folder, directed me to stare at a webcam, and disinterestedly took my photo. I had made the cut. A few months later, the culmination of all these years of assiduous documentation arrived in the post, my biometric residence card, which now said indefinite leave to remain. On the train from Croydon, I tried to feel relief. Was I excited? No. Was I happy? I tried to cry just to feel something, but I just felt flat. It was only years later that I'd realized I'd experienced a very small taste of the alienation that comes from encountering our nightmarish immigration system, a system in which people can be reduced to points, a field here for speaking English, another cursory field for graduating uni, where records can simply evaporate into thin air. Your grandmother can be deported despite living here her entire life, and the complexity and richness of human life can be boiled down to a simple checklist. Can you prove you deserve to be here? And more importantly, can you afford to pay for that privilege? Meeting David and working on that documentary made me realize that for all my politics, I'd never really connected emotionally with what I was covering before. I think partly that was because as an Asian woman, I was wary of becoming the story. I didn't want my identity to dictate my career. And in fact, working in fashion at the start, at a time when the question of diversity on the catwalk and in magazine covers hadn't even started yet, made me feel like it was somehow necessary to assimilate into this overwhelmingly white industry to avoid sticking out. My difference wasn't something to be celebrated or noted. They were just something that put me at a disadvantage. But I also feel like this is something that happens to many people of color working in the creative industries, especially if you, like me, belong to a community that has been historically underrepresented and is, at least in the UK, not as large as other ethnic groups. You're often the only person in the room, and that makes you quieten down, makes you tamp down on everything that makes you different. You sand down your rough edges and you start feeling self-conscious about your accent or the way you look. Working at Broadly, too, made me even more wary of becoming the story. This was during this boom in personal essays where female writers could easily get bylines if they were willing to excavate their most personal traumas and write them up for a publication. But I always felt uncomfortable doing that, and I was honestly more interested in speaking to other people about their experiences rather than my own. In one way, I've been really lucky to be born and largely brought up in Singapore. At the time in Singapore, I felt like an outsider because I was bisexual, but I totally neglected my privilege as a Singaporean Chinese person in a predominantly Singaporean Chinese society. I was privileged to have the experience of being in a majority, and I only started grappling with what that meant when I came to the UK and found myself in the minority. So when I came here and experienced my first microaggressions, like people being surprised at how well I could speak English or the fact that I was fluent, I actually thought they were being quite charming in that people were being deliberately stupid in order to flatter me. It was only later on that I realized that many of these comments were actually rooted in ignorance, not politeness. But the Stansted 15 documentary taught me that my difference was also valuable, and it was valuable in that it gave me an empathy and my breadth of experience that made me relate to people from very different circumstances and backgrounds, because I knew to a very small degree what it was also like to be dehumanized and to be treated like a number by the British state. I spent so long not thinking about that because it was an enormously stressful and traumatic point in my life. But after the documentary, I became much more determined to talk about it because I, unlike David or any of the people with uncertain immigration statuses that I met in the documentary, I was one of the lucky ones. I eventually was afforded the right to remain. And I still find it a bit tough to talk about it now, so I'll just read a bit of my writing on it again. For many of my British friends, white British people in particular, it's hard to understand this idea that the machinery of the state is not your friend. It's the difference between seeing a go-home van as either a bad omen or a stupid joke. The difference between crossing the street to get away from it, hoping that it doesn't somehow see you, which is stupid, I know, but superstition works in strange ways, and taking a picture of it on your phone so you can make fun of it on Twitter later. It's the difference between knowing you can send off sloppy paperwork and suffer no consequence, and deliberating for hours over whether a rogue paperclip or a blue biro could send an invisible Home Office worker into a fit of rage and tear up your file. Does it happen? Who knows? The online forums where immigrants gather to swap horror stories are awash with tales of missing passports and years of paperwork gone astray. When you send your application into the gaping maw of the UK border agency, Who knows what might look back? Is a van ever just a van? I started writing and talking more about it, but it's difficult to get people interested in a topic as huge and unwieldy as immigration. You have to find human ways of approaching the story. And this is how I ended up pitching a podcast to the BBC called United Zingdom. It's ostensibly a lighthearted podcast about me figuring out whether or not to give up my Singapore passport for a British one and traveling around the UK to ask Brits what they think I should do. But really, it's kind of a pitch to find the real soul of the United Kingdom and what it thinks about immigrants. It's an argument against trying to narrowly define what it means to be British and to throw it open to a more expansive and welcoming definition. It's also, as a lot of other immigrants got in touch to tell me this, one of the first times that an immigrant has ever really spoken about the choice involved in giving up the nationality of their home country to get a British passport, and all the implications of that in a post-Brexit age. It also led to one of the proudest moments of my professional career. British-Japanese pop star Rina Sawayama, after reading this article on the right and listening to the podcast, got in touch with me to ask if I wanted to do an interview with her about how she'd been banned from entering the Brit Awards on account of her nationality. Like me, she couldn't give up her British passport she couldn't get British passport without giving up her Japanese citizenship, even though she'd lived here with no problems since she was a child and considered herself British. She said she'd never heard of anyone else in a similar position, and we spoke for an hour or so on the phone about it, and eventually it produced this article, which you can see on the left. It's othering British-Japanese artist Rina Sawayama can't enter British awards. The piece went viral and was picked up by media outlets around the world. And a few months later, the Brits announced that they would scrap the passport clause to allow nominees who have lived in the UK for 5 years or more. And as a response to this, the Mercury Prize also changed its nationality criteria, which meant that in 2021, the East London rapper Berwyn was nominated for the Mercury. He was born in Trinidad and moved here when he was 5, but still does not have a British passport. It's not too much of a stretch to say that none of this would have happened if I hadn't started talking about my own immigration story. And at the time, I was honestly scared and terrified of speaking out about it, because the fear of those go-home vans coming to get you honestly doesn't go away. It only really fades over time. But now I know that talking about it was actually the right decision. And I started to connect my own personal history with the overarching history that I first started learning about while writing Forgotten Women. And you realize that the systems that have disenfranchised people have always existed, that there have always been governments and states and institutions that have treated people as less than human, as numbers or commodities to be pushed around a spreadsheet. This is what led me to work on a series for Vice called Empires of Dirt, which talks about colonialism and the history and legacy of empire, things that I started talking about in Forgotten Women, which albeit through the lens of women's history. It was filmed entirely during lockdown, which is why the videos of me walking through places like London, Glasgow, and Bristol look so empty. But I think it adds to the effect, because many of these places are haunted by their pasts. It's just that many of us don't actually know that that's what we're looking at. How many people looked at the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol without understanding or knowing about the true horror of his slave trading past until it was torn down? This is an episode that I did about stolen museum artifacts, which led on directly to my next project, the Unfiltered History Tour. If we could play this episode now. Thank you for that. I feel like you should be applauding the Pit Rivers because they actually gave us permission to film in there, knowing that we were going to do a video that basically slams a lot of what they do. But they are actually one of the good guys in the museum industry. And there is a happy story, well, not quite a happy ending, but the beginnings of a happy ending in that just this week it was announced that the Smithsonian Museum, which is I think the biggest museum of its kind in America, is going to be returning its Ben and Bronzes as well. So this episode directly led me on to working with an agency called Web Chutney and Vice to create something called the Unfiltered History Tour, which is a project that uses AI technology. So you can take your smartphone when you go to the British Museum, open an Instagram filter and scan certain disputed artifacts in the museum. And once you do that, your screen will then reveal an illustrated history of the point of its looting and removal from its home country and people from that country, like Nigerian Biennale artist Victor Ehikamo Meno, who has currently actually got work set up in St. Paul's Cathedral here, will begin speaking about what the artifact means to their people and why it should come home. And the audio has also been turned into a podcast series, also called the Unfiltered History Tour. This was all done totally guerrilla, separate to the British Museum. They had no idea we were working on it up until the day before it went live. I'd like to play you a trailer just so you can get a little taste of what it looks like. So my favorite episode is mentioned at the end of that trailer. It's on Hoa Hakananai'a, which is otherwise known as the Easter Island statue in the British Museum. At the end of the episode, Tarita Rapu, who is the governor of Easter Island, sings a traditional song and asks listeners to play it to the statue the next time you go so he feels a little bit less alone. And honestly, it moved me to tears the first time I heard it. You can listen to an extract from the episode here, which is featuring Tarita singing, and Sergio Rappo, who's a filmmaker who's also from Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as locals call it. The singing at the end is the song that I'm talking about, if we could play it. working on stories like that and on stories about women like Rina Sawayama also made me slowly understand my own ethnicity as it relates to me being in the UK. I don't think I'd really processed what a change it had been to come from Singapore when I was in the majority to somewhere where I was in a small minority. And at first, I chalked this up to culture shock. But really, when people look at me in the UK, I'm very aware they're not seeing my Singaporean culture. They don't think to myself, now, there's a girl who knows the difference between Singapore and Penang Laksa. What they're actually seeing is my race. And in many ways, I have no control over how people perceive that part of my identity. There will always be a minority of people who look at me and think unkind things, or things that are just factually untrue. Like the kid who DM'd me last year to accuse me of eating dogs and bats. In the circles I move around in, though, the vast majority will either gloss over my ethnicity because the usual signifiers of otherness, distinct accent, English as a second language, a different way of dressing, aren't there. Or they'll be intensely curious, almost touristy, about my heritage, because being interested in other people's cultures is a signifier of being worldly and well-traveled. I was actually having a conversation with Claire Calder, who's a Japanese-British author, today about how East and Southeast Asianness tends to get glossed over in this country. People don't really know what to make of you if you're East or Southeast Asian, or EC for short. They don't know what to make if you're in the UK and not, quote unquote, in the motherland. There's always an assumption that we're perpetually foreign, or if we're lucky enough to look young enough, international students. But it never really stung as hard until the pandemic, because coronavirus meant that I was reading about anti-Asian hatred and violence almost every other day. It started in America with attacks on the elderly, with Asian people being pushed over, punched, even killed, and then it happened in the UK too, with lecturers and students being attacked in broad daylight by people shouting racial slurs. And just like the Stansted 15 documentary, it made me question a lot of things that I'd taken for granted here, the slights and shrugs that I'd shrugged off. Once, a much older man screamed at me and told me I was an insect for not getting out of his way on the pavement. I don't know why, but something about the way he looked at me and said the word insect made me think, well, would he have said that to a white man? Then there was the middle-aged woman just the other month who came up to me at the Francis Bacon show at the gallery, who reached up to me and put her hand in the small of my back and pushed me out of her way so she could look at a painting. Would she have done that to a man or a woman who looked exactly like her? Or there was the man who straight up shouted coronavirus when he cycled past me on the street, or because I'd coughed. Would he have done that to anyone else? I think this is the insidious thing about living in a country where your ethnicity has been largely made invisible. Part of that invisibility is honestly because the government has never really tried to count how many of us there are. In fact, the UK census only allows you to select any other Asian group if you don't fall within the Chinese, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or Indian categories. But estimates currently range up to 1.2 million, or around 1% of us in the UK are East or Southeast Asian. Unfortunately, you wouldn't know that by looking around you. Recently, a report by a group of EC academics, politicians, and organizations was published as a response to the government's call for evidence on ethnic disparities and inequality in the UK. It found that we take up only 0.27% of the most powerful positions in the UK, far below the actual proportion that we occupy in society. There's never been an EC cabinet minister or head of the BBC, for instance. And when I first came to the UK, I found this kind of stuff really easy to shrug off, because we aren't as big a community as other groups, so why does this lack of representation matter, right? But the rise of anti-Asian hate showed me that hate and fear breeds in those absences. Without EC people talking about their experiences, their lives in the UK, people in the UK were all too easily able to tack onto their fears and anxieties about coronavirus onto us. And it made me much more determined to report on these issues and to highlight British East and Southeast Asian talent like Gemma Chan, whom I interviewed for the front cover of Vogue this year. When I look back on my work and the processes behind how I made this work, I honestly have to say that I found it initially really hard to think of a through line. I'm not like an artist who has single-mindedly honed in on a particular issue time and time again, refining their approach as they go along. But I think that one of the things that honestly unites everything that I've talked about is a desire to bring things that are hidden up to the surface, whether that's forgotten women or forgotten stories of colonialism or empire or race. If you went back in time and told the 21-year-old me, fresh from journalism school, desperate to get front row tickets to London Fashion Week, that this is what I would be doing at the age I am now, I honestly would not have believed you. And in fact, I probably would have thought it would be a bit boring. But I think that is the power of using your own experience as a sounding board for your work. I resisted it for so long because I didn't want to be boxed in or labeled as the Asian immigrant or the Asian woman, because those labels never quite felt expansive enough to encompass everything that I am. But now more and more, I think that's down to a failure of my own imagination. I never realized that I had the power to expand those labels myself. It was also partly because I think I was running away from a lot of the complex and difficult feelings I had about how I was treated as an immigrant and as an Asian woman in this country. But meeting people through my journalism, people like Tarita and David and Rena, taught me that these feelings aren't mine to bear alone. They're actually quite universal ones, and that I'm in the privileged position of actually being able to communicate some of those feelings and stories to the public. In many ways, these are experiences that have actually made me a better and more empathetic journalist and writer. Singapore is a very small dot on the world map, and Britain is, despite what it might think about itself, only a slightly bigger one. But being reflective about my own experiences and using them to connect with other people's stories of being disenfranchised or marginalized, that, I think, is the thing that connects my work all the way from Singapore to the UK. Thanks very much. I will take some questions now if people have any. We've got a roving mic too. I think some, yeah, in the fourth row.
Hi, Zing. Lucian here. I met you at the GGI night a while ago, and you gave me a slice of pizza, thank you.
Hey.
When I was working at midnight. I've been following your career, it's creepy as hell it sounds, since I was 16, you know, when you were in Broadley on Vice. First time I saw, and forgive my phrasing, a yellow person is what I identify with, speaking good English, because usually they don't bother because it's not funny enough. Usually they pick the people with an accent. But doing something serious, doing something sincere, and I've followed you up until now, and it's exciting to see what you come out with, and I just wonder, after this brilliant presentation, where do you plan on going now?
Well, first of all, I hope the pizza was nice.
It was all right, it was cold.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the sad reality of eating a pizza in a club at midnight. Yeah. Honestly, I think everything in my career has sort of happened by, I wouldn't say like luck, but like happenstance. Like it's just like a series of dominoes and opportunities that I've been open to that have like led me to doing different things. Like I never realized that, you know, even just talking or writing about being an immigrant would mean that, for instance, Rena would start talking to me about this. So I think the most important thing, like, is just to be open to new things, to just be aware that everything you do can lead to something completely new. I mean, when I heard about Berwyn being nominated for the Mercury, and I didn't even write about it at the time, but other publications are writing about how the fact that Berwyn was only entered and nominated because Rena Sawayama had changed the rules. Yeah. I honestly cried.
Yeah. You did that. I mean, in my eyes, at least.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I mean, Rena told me she was crying. She was like literally on the floor crying as well. But I think that's kind of what it's all about. You never really know what's going to happen as a result of you being more honest and open. And I think that's something that I just want to hold on to, because I think as you're a journalist, it's really easy to get narrowed down. And amazing things, really. Like my entire career is the result of amazing things happening because I just pushed myself to be a bit more open.
Thank you, yeah. I think that's why you're so amicable.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We've got someone in the front.
You're saying now, with the last 10 years, you've been able to do a lot of projects, which I guess when you're talking about the traditional journalism career, you've kind of moved away from that. Do you find that you've maybe reached a level of success now, which has given you a certain freedom to take on things that might be a risk otherwise?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think, for instance, we would have been able to do the Unfiltered history tour if I hadn't reached a point at Vice where I was senior enough where people could say, yeah, this is going to take a lot of work, but we should try and give it a go. And I think that's something that comes from experience. I'd worked on like tons of difficult stories, really complex stuff before. And then when it came to kind of working on something like this, or Empires of Dirt, which is like a real punt, because as one of my colleagues described it, it's very much me hectoring people in a good way. But it is, some people feel as if it's like me punishing the white people for not being educated enough about their own history. Which I personally think is fine, but you know. But I think that only came from because I was senior enough to kind of push for it and to push for a certain, approach and an editorial slant, and people trusted me. So I think that, it boiled down to just sticking around and having that experience and seniority to say, this is gonna really resonate with people. And to be honest, that Empires of Dirt series is the thing that people come up to and talk to me about the most. And it's been really, really gratifying to see. Towards the back.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. I imagine there's a bit of a gang of us here from the magazine course at City, so hey.
Oh my God, hi.
Hi. So I guess we're all kind of interested in a bit more about the beginning of your career, that time at Wonderland, and how you found those first steps. Obviously, you've come a really long way since then.
Oh, I found it really difficult, actually. Like, at the time, I think I was so green that I didn't realize that actually being paid minimum wage to work in a fashion job isn't okay. And I got that job because I actually talked to an editor who came down from Wonderland to the journalism course. He did a Q&A meeting the students and stuff, and I talked to him afterwards, and he offered me an internship, which then turned into the job. But I think it was really challenging because it was at a time when fashion magazines didn't really trust the internet or social media, which seems absolutely mad now, but that was basically the vibe then. They didn't really understand the point of Instagram, if you can believe that. They didn't really know what Twitter was meant to do, and they didn't really know how to talk to their audiences on it. And that's enormously changed since then, obviously. But I did find the first few years like really challenging because there was working really, really hard on platforms that people didn't yet really respect or trust, especially people in the industry. I'm really grateful to have done it, but I would say to people now, do not accept a minimum wage job as your first job in journalism, no matter how good it seems, because it will, eventually give you a really bad cough. And it might be a good stepping stone initially, but I think journalism in general has a bad history with underpaying, and particularly in fashion, and that's probably one of the reasons I moved away from it, because I saw a lot of really just bad work practices carrying out in fashion that I, at the end of the day, didn't really agree with.
For your talk, I really enjoyed it. I've got a question around decolonizing museums, and there's been like a really important discussion around it recently with books by Professor Dan Hicks, the British Museum, and the Uncomfortable Art History Tours by Alice Proctor, and the Stuff the British Stole podcast. And I just wonder about your Unfiltered history tours. Do you think that you got a kind of really positive and good response and rapport with the people you were interviewing because you're a person of colour and can kind of empathise and have a kind of more direct relationship with that sort of sense of displacement and your kind of direct personal history?
So I didn't do a lot of the interviews. I actually deliberately picked a woman of color to be the researcher who did a lot of the interviews, and a producer who was from an LGBTQ producer who was also a woman, because I wanted to work with these people, and also because I thought that the stories they could get out of people would be just so much more meaningful and deep, and they did an amazing job. I actually do think that when people talk about diversity and inclusion in, newspapers and newspapers and publications and, TV, I think it's not, I think a lot of people tend to think of it as box ticking, but it really isn't, because I think that the stories you get out of people when they feel like you're on a level with them are so much more meaningful, when they don't feel like they're being gulped at, when they don't feel like it's someone who's just a tourist, when they don't feel like you're putting them on the spot to get something out of them and that you're interested in them as people. I mean, I think that the reason why the Unfiltered History Tour really makes people feel a certain way is because these people are speaking really honestly about how they feel and their personal connections, and it's not just an academic explanation of what this artifact is and, the history around it. You can tell from audio, and I think that's something that is really powerful about the audio medium, and that's why I really love podcasting, because it doesn't matter where they're speaking to you from. There's something about someone talking in your ear that feels so intimate, and I think that's why the tour has done really well. There's TikTok videos out there, which is crazy, of people doing the tour, and it's 300,000 views, and it's that kind of coverage you just can't really buy. And if I was at the British Museum, I'd be thrilled, because I think a lot of young people are doing the tour now and actually going to the museum, but we don't actually know what they feel about it. Nope. They probably know. They definitely know about it. We sent them a letter, but they haven't actually officially said anything, and they've not said anything to us either. Yeah, it's great publicity for them, but no, they haven't been in touch. Yeah, in this third row.
Hey, thank you so much. This is probably the only time I've seen an EC woman talk, and so it's really amazing. And yeah, what communities do you connect with and feel part of, and what would you like to see them achieve?
Well, I honestly think that there's a kind of community that you could build that's really strong and powerful of, I guess you would call them Commonwealth countries, but that feels like Britain getting to define what that community is on Britain's terms. But I've honestly spoken to so many immigrants who come from countries that have a history of British colonialism or part of the empire, and our experiences are actually very similar. I mean, I like to say that, there's a McDonald Road in every single former British colony across the world. You could literally go to, there's one in Hong Kong, there's one in Singapore, there are tons across the world. And I think that is kind of what connects us, because if you think about it, Britain wasn't as innovative during its empire as to come up with a brand new system of government for every single country that it invaded and colonized. It just imported the same things over and over again. And it's something I talk about in Empires of Dirt, where one particularly very troublesome piece of legislation, the Penal Code, was imported across to most of the empire and had the effect of criminalizing sodomy and therefore all homosexuality by default. And a lot of countries are still grappling with it today. Singapore recently actually slapped down a motion to continue holding on to it, which tells you something about how pernicious it is. And I honestly think that there's a really strong, argument and basis for solidarity between a lot of post-colonial countries, especially those that were part of the British Empire. I don't know how that might happen. I don't know what form that would take. I guess what exists right now is the Commonwealth, but again, it feels like that's being defined on British terms. But I think it's a really, interesting idea, and I, would love to see it happen in real life.
Yeah, I probably speak on behalf of the ISEO community for saying thank you for doing what you do. It's fantastic. I think one question is obviously, during the pandemic, there was a lot of, anti-Asian hate, on social media, and you wrote these fantastic articles and did these projects to highlight the issue. And obviously, with the US and the anti-China sentiment going around, how did you see mentally for yourself? I know you're a professional. You have a job to do, but how did you stay focused to deliver the best content?
I feel like part of it was also because I was talking to so many different EC people, and in some cases, we were bonding over experiences that we'd never really realized we had in common before. One of the stories that is on the slide is a story I did for Refinery 29 about Asian women's experience in the UK of being objectified. And it was honestly, I talked to maybe 6, 7 women about it. Not all of them made it into the final article, but it was honestly quite wild how so many people's experiences were similar and they never even knew it. One of the things that I'd always found really strange when I came to the UK was the number of people who would touch my hair and comment on it. As being like, oh my God, it's so black, or oh my God, it's like so straight, or like soft, or whatever. So you're laughing now because I bet someone's done it to you, right? Yeah. And the number of women that I spoke to for that article who were like, yeah, and the thing with the hair touching, what's up with that? It's, yeah, and you know, moments like that that were somehow really affirming and bonding at the same time, that's kind of what carried me through. Because some of this stuff you just have to laugh because it's actually like wild how so many people don't know about it. And it actually made me feel actually quite affirmed in the fact that I always thought it was really weird when people touched my hair, and hearing other people talk about it too made me feel like I wasn't just gaslighting myself over how weird these experiences were.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a brilliant talk. I wanted to ask you what your average workday looks like. So you talked about that crazy period of writing 4 books in a year. How do you decide how you're allocating your time now? Are you able to draw lines between projects or between work and life outside of it?
I'm trying to have more of a life outside of work. You can ask my friends and my partner how that's going. I mean, a typical day for me, I go back into the office now twice a week. So a lot of my work at Vice is commissioning and editing people and working with our editors and writers on staff on stories. Obviously, that's now become incredibly hectic because of the situation in Ukraine and the rest of the world. So I mainly focus on that, and then I do a lot of podcasting around that in my own time. And when I need to go out for a full day of work for freelance, I usually just take the day off work. So yeah, it's quite full on, but I think I'm one of those people where I just hate being idle and I love work. It's probably the most Asian trait about me. So yeah, I mean, my typical day is actually quite busy. But not as busy as when I was writing 4 books in a year. Yeah, right at the back.
Thank you. Thanks so much for all of these amazing answers and for your presentation. I just wanted to ask you, based on what you were saying at the beginning of your presentation, how you didn't want to become the story. Now that you're an editor, now that you commission a lot of different writers, do you find ways to address who they are and encourage them to perhaps bring that empathy that you learned how to sort of find in your own work?
Yeah, definitely. And I work with a lot of young writers as well. So, you know, the people here from City, I've actually commissioned people from City who are still studying their degree. So if you have any good ideas, just email me. Jason actually has my email. we still talk. Jason's the tutor that I studied under at City. And yeah, I would say that I've definitely moved away as an editor from commissioning stuff like opinion pieces and personal essays because, like I said in the talk, I always felt quite uncomfortable about the kind of asking people to excavate their own kind of past and heritage or trauma for like the benefit of an audience, basically. And I always push people more towards, you know, I know there are things that you talk about with your friends, with your communities, your families, that you just have never, ever seen people talk about in the press before. And what are those stories? And really interesting things have come out of discussions like that. So one story I always like to raise as an example is a story from someone who wrote about why black hair shops in the UK are always owned by Asian guys, which is something that people talk and notice all the time, but has never really been talked about before. So she talked to the owners of PACs, she talked to people who owned black hair shops, and kind of traced this whole history of how that came to happen in the UK and why it's a really uniquely UK phenomenon. So it's stuff like that that I'm always really interested in hearing about, because it's always stuff that I find really interesting. It always has to do with people's identities, but it's not about seeing someone as just their soul, seeing someone solely as their identity. It's about the stories you can tell around that. in the back.
Hiya. Thank you so much for the talk today. I just feel like personally I resonate with so much you said as an East Asian woman, as a journalist, as an immigrant as well. So I was just wondering, like, what advice would you give to like early career journalists, particularly like as an East Asian woman, working in like a newsroom that's typically filled with white middle-aged men, and like in an environment where you like really trying to like prove yourself as a PLC, but also wanting to, you know, cover more stories like from your community and like about your background, etc.
Does your newsroom have any other POC people?
A few, but it's very,
It's
majority, predominantly white.
Yeah, I really empathize. It's like a horrible situation to be in. I think I always say that you have to start building your own community. And I've gotten so much from speaking to other POC journalists, not just East or Southeast Asian journalists, because I mean, literally there are not that many of us, unfortunately. But we all have the kind of same experience of being in white-dominated newsrooms. And I think that when you build bridges with other people in that way, it's actually really meaningful. And also, it means that you don't go absolutely around the bend when someone says something to you that's just like really off. And I've personally gotten a lot from my relationships with POC journalists, both at Vice and outside of Vice, people that I met at my journalism school, because we kind of all keep each other sane and know what we're talking about. And I don't know which newsroom you work in, but some places like, for instance, The Guardian have like BAME networks that are good to join. Sometimes like if your workplace is unionized, there'll be a BAME rep who's good for introducing you to people. I was the equality rep for my union at Vice before I became editor-in-chief. So I was, you know, linking people up and like helping people in that way. So yeah, I think it's really tough, but I think you have to just find a group of people who will support you. And, you know, sometimes they could be, you know, the white middle-class, middle-aged white guys too. Mustn't exclude them, but, you know, I would say most of the time it tends to be other people who are POC.
Thank you for the talk. I wondered if there are any writers or journalists or presenters who particularly inspire you.
I love Isabel Young's work. She was a correspondent for Vice, and she went to Xinjiang way at the start when the reports of the concentration camps were only just starting to trickle out. Really, really enormously brave stuff. I don't think she could ever really go back to China ever again after doing that documentary. She's an amazing like foreign correspondent, and probably I feel like she might be one of the only British East and Southeast Asian foreign correspondents out there. She's amazing. Definitely check out her work. And also, in terms of other POC journalists, I worked with Shirin Kale, who's now at The Guardian, when she was at Broadly, and honestly, she's an amazing journalist. And I read everything she does, which is not difficult considering that she now writes pretty much half of G2 every week. And yeah, her work is really impressive as well.
She's amazing.
Yeah. Any more questions? Just in the fourth row.
Can I steal
Yes.
it first? Hi, Zing. My name's Abby. I'm from Voices here, alongside my colleague Natalie at the front, who asked about your mental health. We work in collaboration with platforms like Resonate and Basine. So yeah, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for all of your work during Stop Asian Hate. I think you managed to clarify a lot of our thoughts and make it digestible to a lot of the people outside of our community as well. A lot of our work is quite quantitative. It's, counting the number of hate crimes that have happened over the years. But we're trying to branch out into journalism and kind of uprising or uplifting stories of people in the industry who have easier backgrounds. And again, wanted to ask you a bit more of a practical question. When you're in a time limit, when you're interviewing people, how do you prioritize what you ask them and make sure that you get the most out of the time that you have with them?
I would say it always works to have a list of questions and then just write a full list of questions and then just rearrange them in order of the importance of what you think you should be asking. It kind of differs because if you have someone who's quite a difficult interviewee, you might maybe want to like lob the difficult questions towards the end, so rather than the beginning, so you don't get off to a bad start. But if it's just, you know, quite straightforward interviews of people who are quite happy to talk, I would suggest like rearranging stuff in order of importance. And then one thing that I found really useful is at the end of interviews, always just say, you know, is there anything else you really want to talk about? And also say, is there anyone else you think I should speak to? Which is really useful because it then connects you with loads of other people.
Amazing, thank you. Do you have like a set number of questions that you want to answer?
Not really. It really depends on, you know, the journey the conversation takes. If you get really good at it in practice, I mean, you sometimes don't need to write down questions, but I always get too anxious about forgetting what I'm going to say, so I always write it down. But I mean, for an hour-long interview, I would usually write down like maybe 30 questions, and I probably won't ask most of them, but it's just a good guide.
Yeah, absolutely. So much interesting stuff to extract. I think this lady
in the fourth row.
Thank you so much for your engaging contents you share with us. It's quite motivate me because I have a quite same experience and the same journalism background with you because I also studied journalism, and also I used to be a journalist in China. So I feel it's very difficult for me to start the journalism working in the UK because the language barriers and also the cultural barriers. So my personal experience, because I applied for Vice about some vacancy before 3 years ago when I just graduated, but I failed. So I just was wondering, when you join the Vice, what do you think is what kind of quality of you to make yourself to outstanding in the candidates? So yeah.
你可以讲中文吗？
Yeah.
我的中文好不好？I would say if you're fluent in a language, that's really helpful because a lot of people I know who managed to work for Vice started out doing it as fixers, so they were really fluent in a certain language, and then they just from there started working more with English-speaking journalists, and then started pitching stories to the publications that the English-speaking journalists worked at. And because there was already a working relationship, it was really useful because they kind of knew this person was reliable and was good at what they did. So I would actually say, if you speak really fluent Mandarin or any other dialect, it's actually really good to work as a fixer initially, because that then helps you get a foot in the door with other kind of publications and other kind of agencies. Like I know someone who did international journalism at City University who's Ukrainian, and I actually worked with her on a documentary in Ukraine. She speaks fluent Ukrainian and Russian, and she started out fixing, kind of like helping to produce documentaries and stuff in Ukraine, and now, you know, she's on Sky News being asked to commentate on the situation in Ukraine. So it's actually really useful to make use of your language skills. And I wish I could speak better Mandarin because one of the real failings of my life, as my mum will tell me all the time, that I haven't bothered to learn Mandarin properly.
So you mean I can speak my questions in Mandarin, right?
So basically, I would say introduce yourself to editors and producers and say you can speak fluent Mandarin, and if they have any stories that they're working on that requires a native speaker to reach out to you, because I think that's actually really useful.
So my questions before is that, what do you think, what qualities you have to make you outstanding when you join the Vice?
I feel like with Vice, it was a difficult one because I got asked to join broadly, and they were specifically going out and looking for women who were progressive and feminist and were open about that, about their politics, which at the time was actually, I mean, this is pre-Hillary Clinton's run for president. which at the time was still very much like a new thing, if you can believe that in the world of like girl bossing and like Molly May. It was still kind of it was still kind of like in its ascendancy. So I would say like be open on social media about your politics, about who you are, because weirdly enough, like a lot of editors rely on Twitter to kind of get a gauge of who you are as a person, and that really helps in terms of scouting talent and in terms of figuring out what makes you stand out from other people when you apply for a job.
Thank you so much.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, this is actually less of a question, more like a comment. So I actually purchased your book, East Side Voice. Sorry, forgot the name for 1 second. But yeah, but what I was trying to say is I'm actually Chinese, but I grew up between China and Canada. The reason I bought the book is that I want to know how British Asians, like their perspective on living in Britain. But silly me that I actually resonate a lot with what I read in the book. So good job on the book. Sorry for forgetting the name. I'm just getting nervous. But yeah, but it is a brilliant book.
Oh, thank you. And like full credit goes to the editor, Helena Lee, because she put it all together and she like assembled this incredible list of contributors, like Gemma Chan's in it, Katie Leung is, Tash Ao, I mean, just amazing writers. And when she asked me to be in it, I was honestly really thrilled. So I'm really happy that it's resonated with people, because I don't think it's just about being British East Asian or British East and Southeast Asian. I think that, you know, Asian Americans or Asian Canadians also have quite a lot to resonate as well with that book.
Yeah, and I do mean it sincerely. Like that has inspired me to write my feelings down, because I actually did my degree in politics, like in Canada, back in Canada. So like you can imagine that as a person of color in a largely white discipline, that was hard. But at the same time, it was worth the time. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll end there. Thank you so much for joining me and spending an evening with me. And yeah, I hope to see you all again in the future. Maybe not in a club where I give you pizza, but maybe in a club where I give you pizza. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.